Hello everyone and welcome to COM 450, Political Communication. Today I wanted to give you sort of a longer video to talk a little bit about the history of political communication, as I keep indicating I'm going to do, but in a very specific way to the field of communication and the way that we study it. And I wanted to make sure that I did that before I gave you your next reading. So for week 4 here, let's focus on that particular area for a little bit. It's probably not that hard to understand that political communication as a field didn't really start in a communication department until about the 1960s, because that's when when communication departments were actually established, separating themselves from English, not from political science. It wasn't until the late 60s to early 70s, when Carlin Cors Campbell came along, that we decided, I guess, that studying politics from a communication perspective was a good idea. What is different about the way that communication scholars study politics and the ways that political scientists or philosophers study politics? First, let's start with sort of the philosopher in political science. They look at the way government systems work. So different kinds of leadership and governing, and sort of the philosophical merits and ethics of those different forms of not just government, but of political thought. Political scientists have a tendency to focus more on different types of government systems and how, on a larger level, a mass level, the behavior of the group of people who are involved in that government function. Communication scholars don't tend to look at any of that. We are interested in the process of sharing, of creating meaning. And so what we usually end up looking at are the messages that are constructed by or within any governmental system, any political system. So for example, that may include looking at the way presidents give speeches, or looking at the way Hitler rose to power, or looking at pamphlets, or looking at writings from judges. There are a myriad ways to understand that, including political advertisements, all the way down to just local government, a local government, all the way down to a school board, right? So I'm going to a school board meeting tonight, so that's what's on my mind, and it's hard to sit there when I know that everybody is getting up there making what in sense is a political argument. What do I mean by that? Well, it's about levels of policy, right? So in a school board, in a city council, in any type of truly local vote or discussion, it is usually a political argument that you are making. It's about policy, thereby making it political. I know it's hard to think about politics that way because it's so heavy laden with an idea of party politics or of a particular type of government politics, or that in saying that you're being political means that you are doing something perhaps shady or maybe just flat out lying. It has different meanings for all of us, but it's supposed to be reflective of how we discuss political, in some cases, policy making, okay? And that is where political communication scholars generally tend to like to live. We may be looking at the effects of a message, or we may be looking at the construction of a message, but we're always looking at how meaning is created, maintained, changed, etc., by the government to its people, or by the people to their government. And when I was in my doctoral program, that's what I wanted to focus on, was specifically the act of the government to the people, or the people to the government. And a lot of people will say, well, the people don't have much say in the government, right? We live in a republic, so it's a representative system. But that's not true. The biggest way that we speak is through our vote, okay? So that's probably the biggest way. But there are town halls, there are school board meetings, there are city council meetings, there are sometimes the state and federal representatives and senators come in to see us. and we get to have some sort of conversation directly with them, especially with the advent of iNews. We called it iNews back in 2000. I think it's the best, actually, all-encompassing term, right? It's individuals who make news and then therefore put it out there. And we do this regularly without thinking about it. We make news constantly, whether it's on your Snapchats, whether it's on your, Pinterest account, whether it's on your little, what do they call that, YouTube Shorts. I mean, it just doesn't matter, TikTok. It doesn't matter. You're making something, an argument of some kind, you're making it to an audience. And what do I mean about an argument? Well, if you're taking argumentation with me or you're taking rhetoric, then you already know that an argument is when we put forth a statement that we then support with data and explaining how that data supports the conclusion that we've drawn or the claim that we're making, right? So when I say argument, I don't mean necessarily that we're debating, but that there's probably some opposition to it, and we're taking that into account when we make particular claims. One of the things I think is missing for people is when videos go viral. So currently in our time, when videos go viral, for example, they are making news. Okay, so for example, most of you know I volunteer at a cat rescue, and one of the cats that I take care of is severely debilitated. Okay, she was born without, her two back legs were twisted up. We've since removed one of them. She's completely incontinent. And she has no tail. So she is a rough mess, because if we try to put a diaper on her, we can't. She has no tail or fourth leg to hold it onto her body. So I end up putting her into little surgical suits, what they call surgical suits, to hold a diaper on. And if I want her to go around walking around and playing, that's how I have to do it. Well, I was actually talking about her online the other day on Facebook, because I'm a Gen Xer. And somebody sent me a little note that said, hey, you should check out this TikTok. And I went over and I looked at it, and it was of a wonderful cat named Cappy Bear. And Cappy has similar debilitations. And so watching that, I was able to learn more about how Cappy is dealt with by his caretaker. And it's making an argument for a good way to take care of a cat who has special needs, and also advocating for cats with special needs. So it's doing all of that. Now, is it on NBC or on, some on Newsmax or on some news channel? No, it's not. It's on TikTok, but it's making a message. Now, back in 2000 was the first time we really encountered this particular iNews, individual news and internet news put together makes iNews, I guess. When we first started with that, calling it that, we were all very concerned with the fact that we could go anywhere and take our phone and record a video of somebody speaking and share it nationally, internationally. That was crazy talk. And yet, when we started doing it, we all thought this is going to be very complicated. We're not really sure how we're going to be able to do it. And then YouTube came out, and all of a sudden, boom, there we were. And now we have news being made that can make or break political campaigns on the regular. We have a lot of division in our citizenship, because we want to disagree, and what videos get the most views are the videos that go viral, right? Those are usually the most oppositional. They're usually the most flagrant. They're usually the most divisive. And so a lot of people ask me all the time, how is it that we study politics now? And I told you at the beginning of this class, I believe, that it's completely different from the way we used to study politics. For a long time, we had a very steady, clear way of studying political communication. And I'm going to talk about that now. What changed it is media. So communication technology and media is a course I teach in the spring, and that is 100% the impact of technology on politics. So here I'm going to focus instead on the development of different types of political communication over time. So let's go all the way back to, we have the Constitution. That was our first big, well, I guess the Declaration of Independence was really the first big political communication that was nationwide, right? Like it was for the colonies to separate from the King of England. That's the short version, right? We could get into more detail another day when we're talking about history rather than political communication. But it was the first thing, it was a declaration, right? After that, we had the Constitution that set up our government. So the first thing we need to understand is that our government was created by words. Our political institutions were created by and are maintained by words. People like to say, oh, well, there's the White House and there's the Capitol. Those are symbols, just like words are. And you can literally house Congress anywhere that you need to. We know this because we've had the Capitol burned down. We've had the White House burned down many years ago. We've had damage to both, and they've been repaired. There's been damage to the Pentagon, which was established much later. Those are buildings. Those are not institutions. The institutions are created by the language that we use and the symbols that we use to represent the government entity, institution that they hold. In other words, communication upholds political institutions. So when I talk about the presidency as an institution, I'm not talking about one president or another. I'm talking, or the White House really, I'm talking about the institution of having a presidency, of what that president says, does, the actions that he or she takes. For example, when they say something and it impacts us all because they are the institution of the government. And I don't know if you remember, but back in 2016, it was pretty quickly after the election of 2016 when President Trump was elected, he was putting things up on Twitter that were like attacking North Korea, okay? And he was making like some personal attacks on the leadership there, on the people there, until he went and made friends with them. But at the time, we were all very concerned because when the president speaks as a representation of the institution, as the embodiment of the institution, that communication generally tends to indicate policy, okay? So I took a long road to get there, but here's why it's the most important thing, is because whenever Donald Trump would say something like, we should attack North Korea, we all were like, oh my God, we're going to war, because the institution is maintained and upheld by the President of the United States and his or her words. So language upholds the political institution. There is a very specific name for that, and it's called the sociolinguistic perspective of political communication. Socio meaning sociological, right? Society. And linguistic meaning language. The sociolinguistic perspective means that we look at how language upholds these institutions of governing. That is just one of the many ways that we can look at political communication. But because the Constitution established our government and institution in words, that's the way we change our institutions as well. And so some of the big speeches by the presidents of the past, we obviously, really look at because they mold, change, somehow modify the institution of the presidency, of Congress, of the Supreme Court, or of our government, federal government as a whole. Some of those include, the Gettysburg Address. Some of those include, or it might include John F. Kennedy's first inaugural, only inaugural, apologies for that. Some of them might include even President Clinton's first inaugural, and I know Barack Obama's first inaugural because he was the first person of color to give an inaugural. That had a big impact on it culturally. Almost all of the inaugurals are important because they set up that institution of the presidency for the next 4 years. Okay, that's how our institution stays alive. That's how our presidency stays alive, and therefore how our democracy functions. So the words of the president are pretty important, just like the words of Kim Jong-un or of I can't think of the leader of China right now. For some reason, his name is on the tip of my tongue. President Xi. There, I got it. Or any other leader in the international stage, what they say matters. Now, in a democracy like ours, whether it's direct or indirect, what the people say is supposed to preempt what one individual person has to say. Thus we have balance of powers, thus we have Congress, thus we have representation, thus we vote, right? And so in a democracy like ours, the people are supposed to have a greater amount of impact on it than any one single individual person. And that's where things get a little testy, right? Because really, how much say do we have? Does our vote count? Does our support for one person over another as leader, whether be that in Congress or in the White House, matter? Obviously, it matters far less when it comes to the Supreme Court, because that gets chosen by the president, by the Senate, not by us. But in the other parts of our institution, our vote impacts a great deal. Therefore, any little slip that might come out and be national news can impact an entire campaign, an entire presidency, an entire national policy. All right? And so when we get to talking about gaffes and turning points, we'll be focusing mainly on those. But there's one set of things there's one set of writings that I think a lot of people tend to overlook. We like to reference them, but we overlook them. And those are the works of John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and whoever the third person was, who I don't remember, he got sick, James Madison. There we go. Or maybe that was John Jay. So obviously I'm talking about the Federalist Papers. And the reason those are so important is because when the United States Supreme Court can't decide on something in its constitutionality, the first place it turns to is the Federalist Papers. And so we don't look at that as the main sort of communication that forms our institutions. But it certainly is the main communication that the judicial branch uses in order to understand whether or not a certain policy might violate the Constitution, right? Or might actually go in with the Constitution. I apologize, my insulin pump is having a fit for some reason. And so that becomes very important, that we look at those as political communication. All right, so let's just say that for hundreds of years, and this is true, for hundreds of years, the president, some Congress people, the newspapers, the essays that people were writing, even from political theorists like John Locke and from Adam Smith, all of these people who wrote these political theory pieces, and from the universities, they're the scholars, if you will, and philosophers. There were a lot of commentaries on how government works. In other words, a lot of political communication going on. Not a lot of people were looking at how the citizenry communicates with the government, because the only time they really did was when they voted. And then it was so limited. And so it really wasn't until like the 1920s through the 1960s that we really started to see more equity in, I don't know if equity is right or equality, I think it's equality, in voting. Okay, so more people got to vote, more people had the right to vote, more people had the means to vote. Now, today we still have some voter suppression that occurs. We don't need to talk about that today, but we have come a long way, baby, since the 1800s. So we know that more people are able to vote. We know that they're able to have more of a voice. And that became very, very clear in the 1960s. During the 1970s and the 1980s, television, cable started to develop, and all of a sudden we started to have local cable networks, channels in your area where we did have some crazy people get on there and talk about what you might see on one of the news stations that you see now. Only it was one person in their basement sort of broadcasting it. And it was very, very unlikely that you would pick that up. It was usually on UHF or on a local cable network station, And then for some reason, things exploded. That reason was the early 1990s and the advent of the internet. Well, let me rephrase. It wasn't the internet that did it. The internet allowed us to send messages back and forth, usually from one to maybe a few people. But the concept of sending a message out that would be able to be seen internationally or nationally didn't come around until the World Wide Web. You're really not looking at the World Wide Web until 1996. And then all of a sudden, people were able to receive news online. And that was a huge deal. How do we evaluate the messages that we're getting online? How do we view things online? There weren't videos on there quite yet. Websites were still really stagnant. You could get some pictures. But obviously, as we moved into, as I said before, 2000, bringing it back around to 2000, was when we really started to see the invention of and the use of iNews. Now think about this for a second. Your news that you are receiving is not edited by anyone. It's not checked by anyone. It's not, there's no truth reassurance. Why does that matter? Well, during the time in the heyday of radio, television, and newspaper news, one of the things we could always count on was that there were editors and fact checkers. Now, a lot of magazines still have fact checkers. Some online magazines have fact checkers. They're making sure that the story represents what the evidence is suggesting it represents. So, for example, there's been a couple of times where I've been called by an editor and asked all the questions. Is this what you said? Is this accurate? Does the author, does the journalist or author or writer capture this particular sentiment properly? And the reason that they did that, and they still do, the reason they do that is to make sure that what news they're putting out is reflective of the evidence that is being used for that particular story. Guess where we can't do that? We can't do that on YouTube. There's no check in the system. There's no one to make sure it's accurate. So we could get all the news we want and people could just be telling their thoughts or their nightmare from last night or whatever they want and pretending it to be true. And so what we once called the urban myth has become more true. And nowhere did we see that than with the Slender Man, right? I'm sure you all heard about the Slender Man killings up in West Virginia and Pennsylvania, where some young girls were influenced to actually believe that Slender Man was real and that they had to kill their friend to satisfy that. Luckily, she did not die, but she lived to tell the tale, and it is scary to think that someone makes up this story, this mythos of Slender Man, and then next thing you know, people are acting on it as if it's truth. This happens daily, okay? And sometimes it has a bigger impact than others. In political circles, this can be devastating. One of the ways that it's devastating, I'm going to use this example here, is with, if you guys remember, it's been some time, but Pizzagate. what happened? Somebody started spreading a rumor, literally, that there was a pizza shop in DC where Hillary Clinton and some other people, all these people were involved in a child sex trade, I believe it was, in the basement of this pizza place. Now, there's a couple things that you need to know. The pizza place does not have a basement. The pizza place served pizza. And to the best of our knowledge, no one who was associated with this story had ever been to that pizza place, okay? However, there was a man who was from out of state, and I don't remember exactly where he was from, but he drove to that pizza place, guns blazing, and shot at it because he 100% believed that the story was true. And if you think you're going in and saving a bunch of children, imagine what you would do, right? We all might get a little violent or angry or something in that case, where we want to save these poor kids who are being violated in one way or another. So does it make sense that he would want to do that? Absolutely. Does it excuse what he did? No, it does not. And it certainly doesn't make the story any more true or less true. In this case, there wasn't even a basement, let alone children there in this pizza shop. So a lot of things got hurt. And I'm not talking about Hillary and the rest of them, their reputation. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the pizza place, the real life people who were there, and the man who decided to take his gun there. Okay? So now, if you want to read about that story, I will go ahead and find you an article or four so that you know I'm not making that story up, right? Because a lot of times people think professors even make up stories to prove a point. And I suppose sometimes that's the case, particularly when we're using hypotheticals or metaphors. But in this case, these are true stories. And so there's evidence that they happened. There were real people who were hurt. And so iNews, such as it is now, can in fact have these devastating impacts. So one of the questions I often think to myself, and I don't know how to answer it, is what does count as iNews and what shouldn't count as iNews? What do people use it for? I certainly have done things like, oh, here's a contraption. I don't know what this contraption does, and I take a picture of it and I do a reverse image search on Google and it tells me what it is. Fantastic. Or I'm prescribed a new drug or a new vitamin supplement or something, and I'm like, going to do my own research and figure out what this thing is. For those of the people who want to take the time to go and dig through the literally millions of web pages that you're going to get when you ask a question like that, great. But if you just go and put a Google search in and say, I don't know, my doctor wants me to start taking Jardiance, okay? Well, there are a couple horror stories out there about Jardiance, okay? But there's also a ton of stories of how helpful it can be. What are you supposed to do? How do you sort that out? Who do you talk to about it? Well, you might go look for more information. You might actually consult, I don't know, your doctor. So there are things that we replace expertise with what we find online. And I'm not just talking about on websites. I'm not just talking about on news sites. I'm talking about TikTok. I'm talking about YouTube. Okay, I'm talking about these things that have been around for 20 years, not TikTok, but YouTube, Facebook has been around for almost 20 years now. I believe it was 2004, kind of hard to believe. And so my point being that even in the last 2 decades, with the advent of new technologies and new media, we have not figured out how to study the political effects, the effects on the political communication that occurs with these new things. When I was studying at the University of Oklahoma in 2000, I was studying with an incredibly well-known scholar, and she was talking about iNews, and at the time I still had a VHS tape that they had just created on using Photoshop and editing in commercials and whether or not that was ethical or not. Forrest Gump came out, we were talking about whether or not it was ethical to place Tom Hanks next to John Kennedy. And in the international ping pong tournament. These things that didn't really happen. But they used real news clips and put Tom Hanks in. And is that ethical? Well, I mean, that's entertainment, right? But what if you're doing it in a political ad? What does that do? So there were many ethical questions just with editing styles back in just 23, 24 years ago. So about a quarter of a century. I'm just realizing now you all weren't born yet, most likely. But so back, not that long ago, let's put it that way, we were actually still looking at the ethical implications of those technologies, let alone what we have now. So the speed at which technology has developed has greatly impacted the ethical questions of political communication, as well as the effective questions of political communication, and also the content of political communication. So in the 1970s, when there were a couple of scholars who just started sort of applying communication principles to the political sphere. Those would have been people like Kathleen Hall Jamieson, Carlin Corse Campbell, who I mentioned earlier, Robin Rowland, who is my academic grandfather. So not that far back, very few generations between me and the first political comm scholars. And that, I don't know what that says about me other than that I'm old, but it also indicates how new political communication as a field of study truly is, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to wrap our brains around it. Models of communication that we've had in the past relied on a very, compared to today, stagnant media and stagnant distribution of political communication. And it certainly did not have the interactivity of the voter, the citizen, to the government. And that developed with the advent of different kinds of political debates. And then that also spurred more parties. And so that spurred more people to get involved in politics, which is never a bad thing. But then you end up with 26 people on a stage running in the Republican primary for the president. That is when things get really, really funky. I'm not going to talk about that yet, though, because that's coming down the road. There are, generally speaking, 4 different ways that communication scholars look at communication. The first, and you probably know these, honestly, the first is the sort of empirical or social scientific way of looking at communication. Generally speaking, this asks questions: what effect does this have? What was the response to this particular messaging? Those kinds of questions. They're generally, or how did that particular communication make you feel? Those questions are generally answered by survey, by moment-to-moment technologies, by not just by computer survey. SurveyMonkey became like our best friend here for a long while, or even short answer. In some ways that were numerically represented. So quantitative data was usually what is used to ask those questions. So it's the more social scientific and closest to the way that political science scholars look at it. The second way is the humanistic, and this is where we want to take into account what the people are actually saying. So we don't want to translate things into numbers, but we want to look at short answers, responses, focus groups, and data like that to sort of call out of it what are the themes? What are the things that are being said here? What can we claim? Now, it's almost impossible to look at effects from that, but you can definitely look at content and what message is actually being sent to the majority of individuals as opposed to 1 or 2. The third is the rhetorical. That is to say that we look at everything as mass influence, okay? So For example, the presidential speeches, some congressional speeches, political advertisements for the nation, not just for sort of statewide or local elections. We looked at those for content specifically, and what is it that the speaker is trying to achieve? What message is being constructed? Do they do it well? And so we look to Aristotle, we look to the traditional methods of argument, we look to the traditional ways of looking at the persuasive nature of political communication. And then finally, we have the critical perspective. And the critical perspective is becoming much more popular. And I want you to listen closely to what I'm about to say. Okay, so the critical perspective, generally speaking, just at its base root, is looking at the way communication is used to construct and maintain power relationships, okay? For example, some of the types of scholarship that are born out of this. Feminism. How is it that this particular work is either upholding or degrading or marginalizing women versus men? And I'm not going to use gender there. I'm going to use sex there specifically because that's where it started. Then, of course, that spreads out to gender, race, sexual orientation, if we want to make that a thing, and the way that people communicate their position in a workplace, so organizational communication, how we position ourselves in our healthcare. One of the things I always argue for is that you better damn well be your best advocate, because no one is there fighting for you as much as you are, and nobody understands your body better than you do. Period. End of story. You are the expert there. However, what do you choose to consult, right? And so in a patient-doctor relationship, you might look and see that the patient has the power in a particular exchange, or that the doctor does, or that somehow our health system is flawed because of how much power we give drug companies, okay? So it's about power relationships. One of the biggest discussions right now, obviously this is where I'm going, right, is with what they're calling CRT in our classrooms. And I don't mean the college classrooms. They're obviously talking about K-12, right? K-12 classrooms, everybody's saying, I don't want them to do CRT. And it just makes me have to take a breath and calm down, because you can't do CRT. Let me explain. When we're talking about theory, political theory, critical theory, math theory, whatever it is, when we're talking about theory, we're talking about those things which have yet to be proven completely, but are generally what we believe is true, okay? So it's not something you do, it's something that exists, that you explore, okay? So when I say it's difficult to find political theories right now, what I mean is it's hard to generalize and make guesses and predict. It's nearly impossible because of the changes in political communication over the past 25 years, okay? In CRT, what it stands for is critical race theory, which is very different from, let's say, for example, critical race studies, which is where you actually study the way that power relationships change or have been maintained or are different between different races, however you define that, okay? So CRT, however, was born out of critical legal theory. And critical legal theory is attempting to understand how legal systems work and maintain differentials in power over time through the laws, through the application, through criminal justice systems, okay? We hear this a lot, right? There's a lot of race theory, and it's actually much more predictable and much more applicable than political theory, because there are very real implications numerically for the way that race impacts criminal justice. Critical race theory, as it's being used, I'm having a hard time with this, only does the following. It suggests that the way that we have taught history and some other courses, literature courses, for example. Let's go with literature. The way that we've taught literature courses has left out or marginalized voices from persons of color, from the LGBTQIA plus community, from poor people, from and we've elevated the ultra rich, the white, and mostly the male. Okay? Now, over time, has there been an increase in more women writing? Yes. In more persons of color writing? Yes. In people who are in poverty? Much less so. And so when we teach literature, if you believe that there is an injustice being done or voices that are marginalized, that you will agree probably to provide more of those options to your students. And so by the time I got to college, I wasn't just reading Catcher in the Rye and whatever the heck my father read in college. Isaac Asimov, really, a lot. He went to law school, but he really liked sci-fi. No, I was reading Toni Morrison. I was reading The Unbearable Lightness of Being. I was reading about LGBTQIA characters who we just referred to as gay back then, or because we just didn't have another way to deal with it. So what we have done over time is started to bring some people in from the margins, give them some power to speak. In the case of CRT, we're talking about people of color, people of different backgrounds, people of different ethnicities, people of different races. Now, why does this upset everybody so much? I don't know. It's been a fascinating study, let me tell you. And I know that that's not necessarily political, but isn't it? Think, for example, this impacts history classes, literature classes, basic English classes. It impacts other classes that we haven't looked at because we don't really do CRT. So hopefully that explains a little bit of what's going on in the political discourse, the public discourse about what the heck critical theory is, okay? So those four paradigms, as I call them, I think as anybody would call them, the social scientific, the humanistic, or constructivist, if you want to use that term, the rhetorical, and the critical are all different ways that people in the field study political communication. And in the beginning, almost all of our political communication studies were in the rhetorical area. They were individuals like myself who were writing and saying, this is what's happening in this presidential speech. And what I'm going to give you to read, I hope, is a sample of my writing just for kicks. It's free. Don't worry, I'm not getting any money from it. It's a scholarly work. It went through several editors, and you can still disagree with it, and that's okay. It's supposed to sort of spur discussion, but I want to show you an example of a traditional rhetorical study of political communication so that we get our grasp on that first. And then we're going to dive a little deeper into some other stuff. As you see on your syllabus, which I'm looking at and you can't see at the moment, we have very sort of broad topics for each week. And so I will mix them and blend them as we go. But I want to assure you that you will not be tested or asked to do anything unless we have covered the subject matter as much as we can. You will, however, be required to do your own research during this course because it's a 400 level course and that's my job. So we will talk more about what that's going to look like. Obviously, with it not being an election year, there's not really much we can do with campaigns and advertising and elections, but what we can do is talk on a broader scale about the messaging that we're receiving in between campaigns, because it's not just any longer, political communication is not just when a campaign is happening or when an election is happening. It's now about what happens in between too, particularly with the advent of the internet and iNews. So that's what I want you to consider for today. And again, I'm going to post a work from me that is a rhetorical perspective on a presidential inaugural. Again, you can agree or disagree with it. It doesn't matter. I'll probably ask a discussion board question about it next week. But first, I just want you to get a chance to read it and think about it a little bit. It should be written in a language that's not overly scholarly in the sense that I think you'll be able to read it in sort of a more narrative form. So hopefully it's an easy read. I will see you on the other side of this. I don't think I'll be doing anything more tomorrow. So I'll post that article right now, I hope, and I will be seeing you guys on the other side of the weekend. Have a good one.